Hello everybody. This video is going to be a quick one over the perception of melody. So we're going to talk briefly about some terminology because this whole video will include some terminology from music theory. And I'll go ahead and mention the caveat that I'm not a musician, and nor have I studied music theory. And so I've learned all this stuff from the sensation and perception side. So please, any music theory folk out there, if I use something in a weird way, please, I would love to see learn how these concepts are talked about in terms of music theory. So please feel free to educate me. So we're going to start with some basic terminology, and then we're going to move into what is a melody. Well, we'll go ahead and start with that. I mean, a melody is a combination of pitches that seem to flow together, that they sound like they all belong to the same unit. And it's composed of phrases. And so a phrase in music is very similar to a phrase in language. And so it's kind of it's a portion of a sentence in language. It's a portion of a sentence with its own independent meaning. It's like a prepositional phrase. Well, a phrase in music is a portion of a melody that has its own identifiable identity. So, twinkle, twinkle, little star. All right, that twinkle, twinkle, and the little star. All right, so those are each different phrases. They can be parsed and considered to have kind of their own identity. Now, so we'll talk about how we pull phrases apart and how we group notes together into coherent phrases, and how then those phrases combine to create melodies. So first, we're going to talk about those basic concepts. So let's get to it. First, let's talk about a note. For our purposes, we'll roughly equate a note to pitch. I know some of the stuff from the music theory folk that I've read mentioned that it is not exactly a pitch, but for our purposes, we'll treat it as such. Because each note is tied to a specific frequency. And we know that we measure pitch in frequency, with frequency, or in hertz, a measure of frequency. Now, an octave is every note between two of the same note. So, for example, we've got A here and A here, all right? And it doesn't repeat again until down here. Well, this is everything from here to here is an octave. Now, one of the defining features of an octave is that you'll note that this frequency, if you double it, is equal to this frequency. So every time we jump up an octave, the frequency doubles. All right. Now, what is a tonic? Well, a tonic and a scale are both tied to keys. So first, we'll talk about tonality. Tonality is the act of organizing a scale around a tonic, which is the base tone or base note in that scale. So, for example, if we had a key of C, right, its tonic would be C. All right. Now you could choose the octave where you would start that scale, and different singers with higher pitched voices or lower pitched voices might have to cause the scale to move up or down. Or if they've got a wide range as a singer, then they can move octaves. But if they're a limited singer like me, then they have very limited range. So a tonic is that that base note in the scale. All right. So essentially, the tonic is the note where a scale begins and where it ends, or at least one note after where it ends. Now, the scale is the range starting at the tonic and ending just before the same tonic, the same tone chroma, one octave up. All right. Now, if we're talking about a major scale, then the notes in between the tonic and one octave up, the same tonic one octave up, is determined by this pattern. All right, tone, tone, semitone, tone. Now, a tone would be one of these notes here. Now, every tone, right, is a every other note goes up a note, it goes up a tone, and then every half is a semitone. So from here to here is a tone, from here to here is a semitone. Okay. Now, if we're talking about minor scales, then it changes. The pattern of that comprises a scale changes. But let's stick to a major scale. So let's talk about key. If we were to create a scale in the key of C, right, the tonic is C. To determine, and if, because C is a major chord, not a major chord, but a major note. If we were to make a C major scale, right, then we would use this pattern, starting at the tonic, moving up to the next, to that tonic one octave up. And so if we do that, right, start at C, right, tone, tone, semitone, right, so transition from here to here, C, D, from here to here, that's, so tone, tone, semitone, C, D, E, F. Start at C, tone transition to D, tone transition to E, semitone transition to F, right? Then we go tone, tone, semitone, right? So tone transition, G, tone transition, A, semitone, all right? I feel like I messed up somewhere. Yeah, so this is the resulting scale, all right? So your key as a tonic, a tonic, and that's your base scale. And then you have your scale that ascends. If it's a major scale, it ascends this way. If it's a minor scale, it ascends this way. All right, so that gives you a basic understanding of some of the small, simple, well, simple, I don't know how simple it is, but some of the basic ideas. So now let's return to a melody, okay? Again, a melody is a series of pitches that we perceive as belonging together, right? And as I mentioned, it's composed into phrases. So how do we parse those phrases? How do we successfully segregate the phrases? Well, we have evidence of us using two different features of the sound. One is pauses, all right? So the longer the length between two notes, and when I say length, I mean in time. So the longer the pause between two notes, the more likely we're going to perceive each side of that as a phrase. The front side of the pause will be the phrase that ends. The back side of the pause is the phrase that's just beginning. All right. Also, distance between the pitches. So we have distance in time. When does one end? How long before the next note begins? The next is the distance in the pitch. So if we transition from a higher pitch to a lower pitch, depending upon how great of a transition that is, we lump the preceding notes into a phrase. So we know that within a phrase, the transition between notes is about an average of 2 semitones long. Transition between phrases, though, is just shy of 3 semitones long. So we use the distance in the transition between pitch and the distance in time between two different pitches. Now, how do we decide how does our perceptual system organize notes together into coherent phrases? Well, again, as I kind of just mentioned, the proximity of the notes to one another. All right. So the closer they are, the more likely we're to lump them together. And in fact, most transition within phrases are small. We also use the trajectories of note transitions to organize them together. So, for example, we have these arch trajectories where we start low, go high, and then we come back down. All right, in the scale, right? That is oftentimes identified or integrated together as a phrase. But we also sometimes have changes, right, in the trajectory. So if we have a upward transition, upward trajectory, and we have a large scale change, so we're jumping from a lower note on that scale to a much higher note on that scale, it's ascending the scale, but we perceive that as a large change. And we perceive everything before that as a phrase. When we see smaller changes, they're usually descending, and we perceive those as a phrase. Now, we also seem to use musical syntax, and so some of this stuff, in the same way that we organize language, kind of translates into the way we organize music. So in the same way that we have phrases in sentences and in music, we have a syntax. So a syntax is just a rule, a set of rules for what kinds of phrases follow others, right? In English, we have noun, verb. That's part of the syntax. Well, there's syntax to music as well. So, for example, the musical syntax refers to rules for how we combine tones. And so we've already discussed tonality. We know what a tonic is. But one of the syntactic rules is that the sounds within a melody or within a phrase only belong to that scale. All right, and so we have this, we automatically, implicitly create this tonal hierarchy. And so, for example, your book talks about, the Goldstein book talks about a study in which they played participants a scale, and then they played them a reference sound, and the participant's job was to decide whether or not the reference sound belonged in the scale. Here you see the average ratings. Now, you'll note that some of these are pretty high, others are fairly low. That creates our hierarchy. So this is just this organized from rated most likely to be included in this, or most appropriate for being included in the scale, to least appropriate. Now, the scale that they gave them was a C major scale. So as we talked about before, right, here are the notes in a C major scale. So we see those right there. You'll note that these notes, you can see them up here, right? They received the lowest rankings. So if we look across these rankings, we see this hierarchy, right? So people think that the tonic is the most appropriate for a scale. Surprise, surprise, it is the basic note of the scale. These chords that belong to, these notes that belong to a chord with the tonic, right? So if you create a chord by moving up tones, so it's or every other tone. So here and here, that's going to be those chords, C, skip D, E. They're going to be in a chord. All right, and so C, G, and E, these are three parts of a chord. So the notes that belong to a chord outside of the tonic, they're rated as belonging to that scale next most, as the next most belonging to that scale. Then the other notes in the scale come next, and then the notes that aren't even in the scale drop out. All right, people don't think that they're appropriate. So again, it would be a scenario where they're played a scale in the key of C, which includes all of these, everything from C to B here, and none of these. They're then played a reference tone that could be any of these, and the participant's job was to rate how appropriate that, or how much that tone fit into the scale. Every tone in the scale they thought fit, and they thought the tonic fit the most. Again, surprise, surprise. So we know that part of the syntax is that people think that only appropriate sounds in the scale should be played as part of the scale. So if you played a key that's out of the scale, or played a note that's out of the scale, people tend to consider that as weird. All right, they perceive that as out of place. But there's also a general trend in melody composition where when you start at the tonic, if you rise, you eventually end at the tonic. All right, that effect is called returning to the tonic. When this is prevented, when a melody doesn't end at the tonic, that tends to sound weird. All right, so that's an additional part of the syntax. So just like with language, verb follows noun, right? With music, you start at the tonic and end at the tonic. Return to the tonic. You only say, or you only play notes in the scale. And if you don't, you're violating syntax. If you don't return to the tonic, you're violating syntax. All right. Now, finally, we know that top-down processing affects your perception of melodies. In fact, if we were to play a series of sounds, so let's say I played Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, right? Well, if I didn't tell you it was Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, or if I didn't sing it for you, and I just played notes that emulated the rise and fall of the notes of that would be played if I were to actually sing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, having those notes, again, assuming those aren't the actual notes, so it'd be like playing, so it'd be like if I took the actual notes of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. Dun, 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 twinkle, twinkle, little star. Yeah, yeah. Dun, 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 dun. Right? And instead of each of those, I chose different notes. But the relationship between the notes was still roughly right. Well, if I didn't tell you I was playing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and I played that series of notes for you, you probably have no clue what I was playing. But if I had told you this is Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, or if I had already played for you Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, when I play this out of order series of notes in a top-down fashion, you might impose your perception of the dun, 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 dun sound. So you would perceptually organize them in a way to match your memory of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. All right? And that, my friends, is that for our discussion of the perception of melodies. As always, if you have any questions, send them my way. But that is it for this video.